Welcome to Modern Myths Daily.
This is a place for stories that have lasted. Stories from ancient cultures, told not as museum pieces, but as living records of how people actually worked, built, decided, and endured. Each journey here is long-form and unhurried, designed for deep listening, for resting, for the kind of quiet that lets something actually settle in. No fluff, no faces, just stories that matter. Settle in. Let's begin. How Great Zimbabwe was built, one stone at a time. Before there were walls. Before stone curved against stone in long, patient arcs across the valley. Before the shadow of a tower fell across packed earth in the afternoon heat. There was the land. Just the land. Granite ridges, rounded and heavy, catching the first gray light of morning. Folds in the terrain that held coolness a little longer than the plains below. A hillside that, to someone passing through, would have looked like nothing. Still. Dry in places. Quiet except for the sound of footsteps. And the low weight of tools being carried into position. But to the people who lived with this landscape, generation after generation, that same hillside was full of decisions. Which outcrop was close enough? Which stone face would split cleanly? Which slope would allow transport? Which position would save a person's body from unnecessary pain 6 hours into the day? This is something worth sitting with for a moment. Building did not begin when a wall went up. It began when someone stood on a hillside and simply looked. Distance was not measured in abstract numbers here. A stone located under 500 meters away was not merely nearby. It was strategically nearby. It meant less dragging, less lifting, less wasted movement, less exhaustion arriving in the shoulders before noon. The hill itself became part of the building system, not an obstacle to work around, but a resource to think through. At around 1,100 meters above sea level, the early air was cooler. A person's body held strength more easily in those first hours. And that is when the work of releasing stone began. Fire came first. Flames were fed against the granite surface for hours, patient, deliberate, unglamorous. The rock absorbed heat slowly, deeply. Then water was brought. And when that sudden cold met the hot stone, cracks opened. Not always cleanly, not always where expected, but often enough to make the method worth the effort. This was not destruction for its own sake. It was a way of persuading mass into a more manageable form. Once fractures appeared, wedges and levers took over. Slabs could be pried free, some of them immense, so heavy that freeing them from the earth was only the first part of the problem. A 5-ton slab of granite is not truly useful until it can be shaped, moved, and placed with intention. So the quarry was never separate from the architecture. It was the first stage of architecture. Around the fresh stone, another rhythm would begin. Hammerstones working surfaces, pecking, correcting, adjusting edges, hands absorbing vibration for hours, fingers going numb, then raw, then somehow steady again. Outer faces slowly worked over until rough rock became something a wall could trust. This refinement was not decorative. It was structural. These walls were not relying on mortar to hold them together. The intelligence of the wall lived entirely in the fit, in how accurately stone met stone. A narrow joint reduced weakness. A well-shaped face distributed pressure more reliably along the course. The tighter the contact, the more stable the whole structure could become over years, over decades, over centuries. That means the builders were not only masons. They were analysts of pressure. They were managers of weight. They were observers of failure before failure could happen. A visitor seeing the completed walls long after would likely notice beauty first. The curve, the layered granite tones shifting from gray to warm red in the late afternoon light, the sense of calm permanence. But that beauty was not applied to the surface. It came out of repeated technical decisions. Each block had to earn its place. Each face had to meet another face with full intention behind it. Once shaped, The stone had to move. Heavy material descending or crossing difficult ground, log ramps, levers, and above all, human coordination. A single boulder was not moved by strength alone. It was moved by timing. Push, reset, lift, hold, shift, breathe, push again. The sounds of that work would have been unmistakable. Wood straining under load, granite knocking against granite, short instructions exchanged across the noise, a sudden warning call, sand and small stones sliding underfoot, breath leaving bodies in sharp bursts, and then the slower silence after movement, when everyone paused to see whether the stone had settled where it needed to settle. What we call construction today can sound like a clean, managed process, but the real act of building is full of friction. Dust settles into the skin, shoulders stiffen, palms harden, muscles compensate for lost balance. Effort accumulates in the back, the knees, the neck. Fatigue is not a sign that something has gone wrong. Fatigue is simply part of the cost of turning geology into form. From those hillside platforms, the built environment expanded outward, gradually, across roughly 80 hectares of organized space. This was not a single wall rising in isolation. It was an entire landscape of structure, routes, boundaries, domestic life, and concentrated authority. The scale matters because it changes how you should think about this place. It was not a monument built for looking at. It was a city. And as the stones accumulated, certain principles became visible. The walls curved rather than forcing straight lines against uncooperative terrain. They followed contours where possible. Their surfaces carried layered granite tones, gray and red and darker shades between, that changed entirely depending on where the sun was sitting. In the morning, these walls might look cool, reserved, almost closed off. By late afternoon, they would seem to hold the warmth of the day inside them. Once those first methods had been established, construction could become something more ambitious. It was no longer only about releasing stone and setting basic lines. It was about scale, about maintaining technical quality while the built form grew larger, more complex, and more socially significant. And this is where labor organization becomes the real story. A structure like the Great Enclosure could not emerge from uncoordinated effort. Its wall extended for hundreds of meters. Its height rose considerably above a person's reach. Its curve had to stay controlled along the entire length. Its inner mass had to be compacted continuously. Its outer stone had to remain stable, course upon course, as additional weight pressed down from above. Different workers, or at least different tasks, had to lock together like the stones themselves. Some hauled, some shaped, some packed core material behind the outer face, some aligned each new course, some supervised, and some watched the whole sequence closely enough to know what came next, and what couldn't wait. It helps to imagine the site not as a ruin, but as a place full of movement. Headloads passing through worn paths, material stacked temporarily, then consumed. Workers carrying smaller fillstone, others guiding larger pieces into position with precise, quiet instruction. Dust rising near active walls, voices traveling unevenly across the terrain, cattle somewhere nearby, storage areas, temporary surfaces, footpaths pressed deeper into the earth with every passing week. The archaeology suggests a world where labor, livestock, and hierarchy all occupied the same space, overlapping, negotiated daily. The hill complex, the Great Enclosure, the valley structures, these were not interchangeable zones. They signaled real distinctions in authority and daily life. The architecture was not only structural, it was social. Walls did not merely hold weight, they held relationships. A 2-meter barrier in early morning mist does more than divide ground. It divides access. It tells one group they belong within, and another that they remain without. It converts authority into route, into threshold, into routine. It means one set of footsteps will always follow a different path from another. Built space is never neutral for long. Consider the stone joints again, so fine that almost nothing could pass between them. Producing that kind of contact required long, quiet correction at the level of the hand. Work that cannot be rushed without visible consequence. One block even slightly out of alignment creates trouble for the next. One weak decision multiplies down the course. So the Masons had to think ahead. Not abstractly, materially. Where will this load transfer? How will this curve hold? Does this stone lock properly into what sits beneath it? Does this course support what will come above? That is technical intelligence, expressed without written engineering manuals, without modern software, without a single diagram. It is embodied expertise. The body learns the weight of a correct stone. The hand learns the feel of a true contact surface. The eye learns to notice what the untrained eye walks past. A tiny tilt, a poor edge, a millimeter of mismatch in the line. Such knowledge is hard-earned, and because it is hard-earned, it travels through apprenticeship, repetition, and example. Inside the wall, behind the carefully placed outer face, angular rubble and damp earth were packed in layers, stomped firm, compacted until they behaved as one continuous mass. It is not a glamorous image compared with the elegance of the finished surface, but it may be the most important image of all. Durable systems depend on disciplined interiors. People often admire completed structures without asking what invisible densities make them stable. But what is hidden usually determines how long the visible surface survives. A wall with a weak heart eventually tells on itself. The final test of any structure is not the moment of completion. It is time. Time in rain, time in heat, time under shifting weight, time after those who built it are gone. Great Zimbabwe remains remarkable because its stones continued to answer that test. The fitted joints, the battered walls, the compacted cores. They allowed major sections to endure through centuries of weather. Rain moved across surfaces and down curves, away from pressure points. Wind searched for entry and found disciplined resistance. Gravity pressed downward without pause. And the wall distributed that force through mass and contact year after year without protest. Endurance looks effortless from the outside. In reality, endurance is the delayed reward of hundreds of earlier decisions. Every correct choice remained active long after the hands that made it were gone. Every well-packed interior layer kept working. Every tightly shaped joint kept resisting. The finished structure became, in effect, stored discipline. Imagine a storm moving across the site in subtropical season, clouds gathering gradually over the granite landscape, air thickening, wind moving first through open grasses, then across wall lines, rain beginning as scattered drops, then steadying into something continuous, stone darkening, earth changing its scent, water searching every seam, every slight ledge, every small weakness in the line. This is where construction quality stops being theory. A poor wall reveals itself under weather. A strong wall becomes quieter under pressure because it has less to confess. The builders of Great Zimbabwe understood something that took no ceremony to learn. They understood it through quarrying, through hauling, through packing, through shaping. They understood it through a day that began with cooler air and strong bodies, and ended with shadows long against warm stone and the work still continuing. Because the work did not end when daylight did. It is easy to live in a time that celebrates speed, quick output, quick growth, quick visibility, quick claims. But stone is a poor audience for haste. It does not reward ambition alone. It rewards patience, sequence, and honest contact. If a block does not fit, it does not fit. If a base is weak, height becomes danger. If the interior is loose, the surface eventually tells the truth. Consider again the image of a mason's hand, tracing a joint so fine that almost nothing could slip between the stones. That is not only craftsmanship, that is restraint. The restraint to continue refining after the stone looks almost good enough. The restraint to care about a millimeter, because a millimeter, repeated many times, becomes structural truth. Or consider the workers compacting earth and rubble inside a wall that no visitor will ever see. No one will praise that layer from a distance. Visitors will praise the outer form. Yet the hidden work is what determines whether the visible form remains standing in 50 years or 500. How much of work operates in exactly that way? Systems, careers, institutions, long relationships, often depending on effort no audience sees. Hidden preparation, repeated checks, quiet resistance to the shortcuts that would later become weaknesses. By the time Great Zimbabwe was eventually abandoned, the daily sounds of work had long ceased. No instructions moved across the site, no loads rolled down ramps, no hands pecked at granite faces. The social world that had animated this place had shifted elsewhere. But abandonment did not erase the argument the stones had already made. They remained, continuing to stand in sun and rain, continuing to hold curve and mass, continuing to tell later generations that the builders had understood something lasting, not through ceremony, not through luck, but through quarry selection, through fire against granite, through leverage, through raw hands, through measured transport, through compacted cores, through controlled curvature, and through foundations that accepted weight without protest. So when we look at Great Zimbabwe today, we are not only looking at old stone, we are looking at accumulated patience. We are looking at a landscape where discipline was turned into form, where the methodical life was not a lesser life, and the slower path, when joined to clarity and skill, became the only path that produced work able to withstand weather. One stone, then the next, until, over years, what once seemed like separate acts of labor became a city of endurance. And even after the voices went quiet, the work continued speaking. Their foundations were real. But not every story of power begins in the ground. Some begin in rumor, some begin in a letter that was never written by the hand that signed it. Some begin in the human habit of placing enormous hope in a place no one has ever actually been. This is the story of Prester John, a king who never existed, and a kingdom that shaped the world anyway. There are some myths that begin in wonder, and then there are myths that begin in need. The story of Prester John belongs to the second kind. This was not a legend told for entertainment around a fire on a quiet evening. It was something more complicated than that, and more human. It was a story shaped by fear, by political pressure, by distance, and by the very specific kind of hope that arrives when people feel surrounded and have run out of obvious solutions. It is a story about a king who never existed, and about a world that needed him to. To understand why the legend took hold the way it did, you have to feel the atmosphere of the world that produced it. It is the 12th century. Christian Europe is not comfortable. Jerusalem had fallen to the Seljuk Turks in 1071, and the Crusades, that long, costly, religiously charged series of military campaigns, had not resolved the fundamental problem. The Holy Land remained contested. Supply lines were fragile. Alliances were unreliable. The Islamic world pressed from multiple directions, and the idea of a unified Christian military response was always more complicated in practice than it sounded in a speech or a papal declaration. Inside that atmosphere, people began to imagine, not idly, not as a pastime. They imagined with the specific urgency of people who are calculating their options and finding the numbers short. What they imagined was this: somewhere beyond the known frontiers, beyond Persia, beyond the deserts and the difficult roads, there existed a great Christian ruler, a man of enormous wealth and military power, a man who was also, somehow, a priest, a king and a holy man in one person, commanding a kingdom of justice and abundance, waiting, perhaps, to enter the conflict from the other side and change everything. His name, as the legend gave it, was Prester John. Prester, from the Latin presbyter, meaning elder, meaning priest. John, a name carrying its own weight of religious significance. Together, a figure who seemed almost too useful to be invented. And yet, invented he was. The first surviving written record of him appeared in 1145. A bishop named Otto of Freising recorded an account brought by a man called Hugh of Gabal, who had traveled from the east and carried remarkable news. He spoke of a Christian ruler beyond Persia and Armenia, wealthy, powerful, descended from the ancient Magi, who had recently defeated Muslim kings in battle and reportedly intended to march toward Jerusalem. The only thing stopping him, according to the account, was the difficulty of crossing the Tigris River. That detail is worth pausing on. He was coming. He was powerful. He was on the right side of the conflict. He was just slightly delayed by a river. Modern historians have connected this story to a real event, the Battle of Katwan in 1141, where a Central Asian ruler named Yelu Dashi, leading a non-Christian people called the Karakatai, defeated the Seljuk Sultan Sanjar in a decisive engagement, a real battle, a real military upset in the east. But by the time that news traveled westward, through intermediaries, across languages, across months of imperfect retelling, it had been transformed into something entirely different. A victory had been reassigned. A non-Christian ruler had become a Christian one. A military outcome had become a sign. This is how rumor operates under pressure. It does not simply distort, it redirects. It takes what is available and reshapes it into what is needed. The people passing this story along were not necessarily lying with intention. They were filtering reality through expectation. And the expectation was powerful enough to override the facts. That is the first quiet lesson inside this legend. When people are under enough pressure, they do not always hear what was said. They hear what they were already hoping for. The legend deepened significantly around 1165. That was when a letter began circulating across Europe. A letter supposedly written by Prester John himself, addressed to powerful rulers of the time, including the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Comnenus and, according to some accounts, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. The letter was not real. It was forged, almost certainly composed in Europe by someone who understood exactly what the audience wanted to read. But it was extraordinarily effective. In that letter, Prester John described his kingdom in terms that were deliberately overwhelming. His realm, referred to as one of the three Indias, was a place of almost impossible abundance. Rivers running with gold, vast armies ready to march, a palace of polished stone and rare wood, attended by kings and bishops who served under him as minor officials, strange and marvelous creatures living at the edges of his lands, a fountain whose waters extended life beyond ordinary limits, and through all of it, order, justice, a ruler so powerful and so righteous that conflict, dishonesty, and poverty had been reduced to background noise. He promised in this letter to come to help, to arrive. The letter circulated widely, in Latin and in translation, for centuries. And the reason it circulated is not simply that people were gullible. The reason it circulated is that people were hungry. A forged letter is never only a deception. It is a test of appetite. And Europe, in that particular moment, had an appetite that the truth was not satisfying. Imagine receiving that letter in the 12th century. Your world is bounded by incomplete maps. Travel accounts are fragmentary, often embellished, frequently wrong. The geography beyond the eastern frontiers is a blur of rumor and religious symbolism. You live with real political anxiety, wars that drain resources, alliances that collapse, a holy land that feels perpetually out of reach. And then a letter arrives, describing a vast Christian kingdom somewhere beyond all of that, wealthy, stable, militarily overwhelming, and already inclined toward your cause. It would not have felt absurd. It would have felt like an answer arriving at exactly the right time. That is one of the most enduring truths this legend carries. People do not always believe myths because the myths are convincing. Sometimes they believe them because the alternative, accepting that no help is coming, is simply harder to bear. The letter became so persuasive, so embedded in the diplomatic imagination of the time, that in 1177, Pope Alexander III sent a formal reply, addressed to the illustrious and magnificent King of the Indies, a papal letter, written to a man who did not exist. The messenger carrying it, a physician named Master Philip, disappeared into the East and was never heard from again. The letter reached no one. And yet, the gesture itself tells you everything you need to know about how seriously the legend had been taken. A non-existent king had become important enough to receive an official response from the head of the Roman Catholic Church. That is not a footnote. That is the measure of how completely a story can occupy the minds of powerful people. Over time, something interesting happened to the legend. Prester John began to move. Because he was never actually found, he could be relocated, and each time direct knowledge expanded into a new region and failed to produce him, the legend simply shifted, moved further, adjusted its address without apologizing for the previous one. At first, his kingdom was placed vaguely in the east, somewhere beyond Persia, perhaps in India, a word that medieval Europeans used loosely to mean almost any distant land of rumored wealth. Then, as the Mongols entered European awareness and missionaries began making contact with Central Asia, the legend migrated there. Travelers and diplomats searched in regions touched by Mongol power. Some accounts tried to connect Prester John to real Inner Asian rulers or dynasties, fitting the myth around whatever unfamiliar authority happened to be visible at the edge of European knowledge. None of it held. Each contact produced information, and information, however partial, is the enemy of a legend that depends on distance. But the legend did not collapse. It adapted. This is the quiet survival mechanism of a myth that has found its way into political thinking. It does not need to be confirmed. It only needs the frontier to remain large enough to hide in. And in the medieval world, the frontier was always large enough. Then, after the mid-14th century, something more significant happened. The legend crossed a continent. It settled in Ethiopia. Not randomly. Ethiopia was a real Christian kingdom, ancient, powerful, possessing its own imperial lineage and its own deep traditions of religious authority. As contact between Ethiopia and Western Europe gradually increased, European observers began to see what they had long been looking for: a Christian ruler, a distant kingdom, a land of religious significance and material wealth. They called him Prester John. The Ethiopian emperor, the Negus, had not asked for this name. He had not applied for the role. He was already the ruler of a real polity with its own history, its own political logic, its own relationship to territory and faith. None of that was relevant to the European imagination, which was not looking for complexity. It was looking for confirmation. And so it took a real kingdom, with real people and real governance, and draped the old legend over it like a map that had been drawn for a different place. That is a different kind of myth-making from pure invention. This is projection onto something that already exists. And projection of that kind carries its own particular damage, because the projected image tends to obscure what is actually there. But the legend had one more chapter left. It spilled outward into the age of exploration. As Portugal began its long project of maritime expansion, pushing down the African coast, searching for routes around the continent toward India, the desire to locate a powerful Christian ally became tangled up with practical navigation strategy. Prince Henry the Navigator grew up with the legend present in the background of Portuguese thinking. And as the expeditions grew more ambitious, the search for Prester John became, in certain moments, almost indistinguishable from the search for new trade routes. In 1487, the same year King John II of Portugal dispatched expeditions seeking a sea route to India, he also sent men overland specifically to find Prester John. Both searches at the same time. By 1520, Portuguese envoys reached Ethiopia. They found not a myth. They found an empire. A functioning, sophisticated Christian state, not the kingdom of impossible marvels described in the forged letter, but something in many ways more impressive. A real civilization that had maintained its identity, its faith, and its independence across centuries without any help from the legend that had been written about it. Prester John was not there. He had never been there. But the search for him had helped bring Portuguese explorers to a continent and to a contact that would reshape both African and European history in ways no forged letter had anticipated. That is the strangest truth inside this story. The myth was false, but not without consequence. It was wrong in substance and real in effect. Prester John did not exist in the form the letter described. His kingdom of marvels and impossibilities was never found because it had never been built. But the belief in him shaped diplomatic decisions, motivated journeys, filled centuries of travel writing, redirected missionary effort, and contributed to the broader imaginative climate that made European expansion feel not only possible, but somehow ordained. A lie told seriously enough, for long enough, by enough people with enough at stake, can alter the direction of history. What finally ended the legend was not a single disproof. It was the slow, grinding accumulation of reality. Better maps, more direct contact, more honest travel accounts, the actual encounter with Ethiopia, which produced a real relationship rather than a mythological rescue. The gradual closing of the great blank spaces on European geography, the spaces where Prester John had always lived most comfortably. When the blanks fill in, the legend has nowhere left to go. And so Prester John faded. Not dramatically, not in a single moment of exposure, but quietly, the way most long-held beliefs lose their grip, through the slow replacement of distance with knowledge, through the steady pressure of geography becoming more honest. And yet something about the structure of the myth did not disappear with him. Because the structure was never really about a medieval king. It was about a pattern of thinking. The pattern of imagining that somewhere, just beyond the current edge of knowledge, there exists a powerful ally, a hidden solution, a force that shares your cause and is already moving toward you. The pattern of taking incomplete information and filling the gaps with the story you most need to be true. The pattern of projecting enormous hope onto places you do not understand, and onto figures you have constructed from rumor and desire. That pattern is not a medieval problem. It is a human one. It appears whenever a situation feels too difficult to resolve from within, whenever the resources available seem insufficient for the challenge at hand, whenever a group of people under real pressure begins scanning the horizon for help that has not yet arrived. In those moments, Prester John tends to reappear, not by name, but by shape. So perhaps the most honest thing to say about this legend is this: Prester John was never just a person. He was a vacancy filled by longing. A king constructed from the specific anxieties of a specific time, yet built from materials that have never gone out of production. The need for a powerful ally in an uncertain world. The tendency to hear, in distant rumor, whatever we were already hoping was true. The habit of moving our deepest expectations to whatever frontier still feels large enough to hold them. Great Zimbabwe was built by people who worked with what was physically in front of them: stone, weight, terrain, effort. Their permanence came from honest contact with reality. Prester John was built from the opposite, from distance, from absence, from the very human difficulty of sitting with uncertainty and choosing, instead, to fill it with a king. And that king, that useful, imaginary, endlessly portable king, held the European imagination for nearly 4 centuries, which may be the final, quietly unsettling lesson this legend leaves behind. We are capable of believing something for a very long time, not because it is true, but because the alternative requires us to face a harder question, one we are not yet ready to answer. 2 stories today, one built in stone, one built in rumor. Both of them telling us something about what people reach for when the world feels larger than they are ready to handle. That is what this channel is here to do. Not to give you answers wrapped up neatly, but to sit with the questions that have mattered longest. The ones that show up in ancient stone and forged letters and kingdoms no one could ever find. Because those questions are still ours. If these stories are the kind that stay with you, share this with someone who listens deeply. Leave a comment telling us which moment landed hardest for you today. And if you are new here, welcome. There is a lot more where this came from. Next time on Modern Myths Daily, we go somewhere else entirely. Another culture, another story, another piece of the human record that deserves more than a footnote. Come back rested. We will be here.